Hello and welcome to the debate right here at Press TV. I'm Marzieh Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, as Iran peacefully transitioned from one president to another, the leader of the Islamic Revolution commented on the significance of that peaceful and democratic transition. As Mr. Hassan Rouhani has become the new president of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei has said that the people's involvement on the political scene and the calm transition is a symbol of the Islamic democracy which exists in Iran. Now, the new president says his government will be based on moderation. It appears that he will be facing many challenges on the international front, especially in dealing with countries such as the United States. Mr. Rouhani may believe in moderation, but it appears that Washington may not. Stay with us as we take a look at this on the debate coming up right now.
Here he comes, Iran's new president Hassan Rouhani. He received his credentials as new president from Iran's leader Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei to start a 4-year term, replacing his predecessor Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution has hailed the peaceful transfer of executive power in Iran as a sign of Islamic democracy.
در نظام مقدس جمهوری اسلامی قدرت اجرایی با متانت، با آرامش، با صفا و صمیمیت بین خدمتگزاران نظام دست به دست می شود، یک پدیده بسیار ارزشمند و مهمی است. این پدیده ناشی است از مردم سالاری اسلامی.
The 64-year-old veteran politician who has now officially taken office as Iran's 7th president says the nation created an epic political event, defying US-led sanctions and attempts to draw it to the corner of isolation. Rouhani will take the oath of office in parliament on Sunday in a separate ceremony where officials from more than 60 countries will be attending. The newly endorsed president won the June 14 election on a moderation ticket and pledges of political and economic changes.
The new government's direction is to revive morals and start constructive interactions with the world. The government will tend to the problems besetting the people's lives and will put a rein on social problems more than anything else. In parallel, in international relations, it will take new steps to raise Iran's dignity on the basis of security, national interests, and removing the existing cruel sanctions.
The United States, Iran's arch foe, has sent mixed signals to Rouhani's election, and that's their way. The US House of Representatives passed its toughest package of sanctions against Iran on August 1st, only 3 days before Rouhani's endorsement. The new sanctions seek to cut Iran's oil exports by an additional 1 million barrels per day within a year. The sanctions left Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with tears of joy. Netanyahu says the US House's sanctions send a clear message to Tehran. Since Rouhani's election, the Israeli premier has been trying to make the world believe that Iran's Rouhani is no different from Ahmadinejad. Israel, the only possessor of nuclear arsenal in the Middle East, wants the West to put a cap on Iran's nuclear energy program. Now it's time to wait and see if the window of diplomacy will remain open during the P5+1 talks with Iran. The next round of negotiations, which will come as soon as Rouhani has his new cabinet in place, will also show how sincere the US and Europe are in their claims of pursuing democracy in dealing with Iran, especially its nuclear program.
I'd like to welcome my guest for the program out of Washington from the Center for American Progress, Mr. Lawrence Korb. And out of San Antonio, Texas, broadcaster and commentator, Mr. Mark Dankoff. Thank you both for being with us. Well, I'd like to start this off in Washington, Mr. Korb. Do you consider the fact that this transition has taken place peacefully in a region where there are either no transition or it comes hand in hand with violence significant?
Oh, I think it's very significant, and I think it's a credit to the Supreme Leader that he endorsed the results of the election, even though from everything that we see, Mr. Rouhani was not his favored candidate. And I think this, compared to the election of 2009, was a very fair and open election. And it does have an opportunity, I think, for Iran to deal with the many problems that it confronts.
Well, what about that, Mark Dankoff? What does it say about Iran itself?
Well, I think clearly the election was legitimate. Clearly it was broad-based in terms of participation. That's all excellent. The bad news is that nothing short of war is going to satisfy the Israeli lobby in the United States. All we have to do is look at the statements of Eric Cantor, the House Republican Majority Leader, who basically indicated that nothing short of regime change would be satisfactory. He said that the United States should have no more negotiations with the current president of Iran than with its predecessor. The second thing that we need to look at is an indication of what's happening here, is that Malcolm Henline, the executive vice president of the Council of Major Jewish American Organizations, recently appeared at John Hagee's bash for the Christians United for Israel organization. Mr. Hagee, of course, is globally known as the most rabid Christian Zionist going. He's based here in San Antonio. Mr. Henline said two things. One, American Christian Zionist support for Israel against Iran and a war with Iran is, quote unquote, Israel's nuclear weapon. The other thing that was said by Mr. Henline is that, quote, the Jewish lobby is a myth. We intend to make it a legend, unquote. When you look at that in tandem with what Eric Cantor has said, and now this letter coming from Menendez and Lindsey Graham with the support of these other 74 U.S. senators, it's quite obvious that we are headed toward a war, and there's absolutely nothing that Iran can do in the way of good faith negotiation, in the way of any kind of future election to satisfy the lust for war that Mr. Netanyahu clearly has publicly stated it, and that the Israeli lobby continues to push for here in the United States.
Well, what about that, Mr. Korb, what Mr. Dankoff has said? You said that Mr. Rouhani coming to office perhaps can be very good and looking at it from the international perspective, but already prior to him taking office, we have seen this harsh reaction by the United States in implementing more sanctions. Excuse me. Tell me your perspective on what Mr. Dankoff has just said?
Well, a couple of things. The Congress can pass all the sanctions that they want. President Obama is not going to approve them. And many politicians from both parties do things that they know won't go into law, but they seem to play well in certain constituencies. Go back and look at Prime Minister Netanyahu. He keeps talking about going to war, but he keeps moving it every 6 months. I went back and checked. I mean, if it was up to him, we would have had war like 5 years ago. So I think you need to understand democracy and the way that it works. Politicians make statements that say all kinds of things, but they really never do get carried out.
All due respect, Mr. Korb. All due respect, Mr. Korb. We have seen not only the politicians making sanctions, but we have seen extremely harsh and intense sanctions implemented against Iran. So we're not just talking about statements. We are talking about a reality.
Well, yeah, but those sanctions were by the international community, which even the Russians supported. Those are different than what the Congress is talking about now. The sanctions that are in place are the P5+1, and they're the group that's negotiating with Iran. It's not just the United States. You know, it's interesting, back in 2009, then President Ahmadinejad made an agreement to ship the enriched uranium to Russia, but he was overruled by Laranjani and the Supreme Leader. So I think when you take a look, you have to put these into perspective. But if you listen to a lot of the statements that political leaders make, and you know, particularly in the Congress, like Eric Cantor, he is he's the majority leader of the House, but that's the only body that the Republicans control, and they can't really make anything happen. When it comes to foreign policy, it's the President of the United States who makes the decisions.
Well, what about that, though? Mr. Dankoff, you basically said the way you set it up was basically the United States appears to be being pulled by the string of the Israelis, especially when we're talking about the situation and dealing with Iran. Wouldn't it be better? Let's look at it from the American perspective. Wouldn't it not be better for the Americans, for American businesses, for relations actually to be improved, to try to make it improve between Tehran and Washington? And yet time and time again, we see an opposite reaction, even though now there is a new president who actually sort of opened the door saying he's looking for moderate policies. But prior to taking office, we see something totally opposite.
Well, I think it's clearly in the interest of the United States to avoid a war with Iran, for the United States not to be dragged into this terrible situation by Netanyahu, and for someone to get the Israeli lobby under heel in this country. And as we turn to Barack Obama, I think it's important that we understand that he is just as much a tool of the Israeli lobby as George Bush was. There is more Jewish money going into the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party in this country. And if you look at what the Israeli media was publishing when President Obama visited Israel the last time, Obama made it very clear that he owed his election to the United States Senate in Illinois and his subsequent election as President of the United States to the overwhelming support of the Israeli lobby and Jewish Americans. The fact of the matter is that Barack Obama has supported the United States and Israel using the Mujahideen-e-Khalq to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists in Tehran. Barack Obama has gone along with all of these sanctions that have occurred up to this point in all of these different economic sectors of the Iranian economy. Barack Obama has time and time again reaffirmed that Israel is America's ally in the Middle East and that the military option against Iran remains on the table. So I think it's a little suspect to juxtapose the president, Barack Obama, on the one hand, with people like Menendez and Lindsey Graham and Eric Cantor on the other. Mr. Obama obviously is being far more careful in public, but it seems to me that when we look at the totality of what's going on here, that we are headed, just as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was headed deliberately for a war with Japan from October of 1940 onward and would not be deterred from it, no matter how many concessions the Japanese made, and President Herbert Hoover is the source for that, by the way. We're seeing the same thing unfolding now. This war is not in anyone's interest, and that's just where it is.
All right, well, stay with me, both of you, please. We're going to switch over to some of our comments by our Facebook viewers.
The Americans and Europeans are only concerned about their political and economic interests. The personality does not matter. They only complain when the personality deviates from their courses. On the whole, any democracy that is not Western-like is not democracy. For instance, Mohamed Morsi was not allowed to even complete a quarter of his term of 4 years in Egypt. They sponsored the military that overthrew him. They never condemned the takeover. They will not change their attitude so long as Iran is not ready to be bullied.
Okay, what about that, Mr. Korb? Let's look at the situation. What the leader of the Islamic Republic said today was this transition is symbolic of the Islamic democracy that exists in Iran. And yet, if we look at other countries in the region, whether we want to look at Saudi Arabia or you want to look at Bahrain or so many others, the United States have very close relationship with. These countries are the furthest from democracy, and yet a country like the Islamic Republic, that the people are actively involved in participating on the political scene. We see this type of friction that seems not to be able to go away. Is it basically about the perspective of the Islamic Republic, the existence of the Islamic Republic for the United States?
No, not at all. In fact, the United States worked very closely with Iran after the attacks of 9/11 to install the government in Afghanistan, Karzai. In fact, were it not for the support of Iran, the Northern Alliance would not have supported Karzai, who is a Pashtun. They also work with Iran in setting up the Maliki was the choice of Iran to run in Iraq. So no, it has nothing to do. I think this is not the United States. Iran is in violation of a treaty they signed, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's why the international community, not just the United States, is concerned. So that is really the issue. What form of government people have is really up to the people of those countries. President Obama was criticized first for staying too long with Mubarak. Now he's been criticized for staying too long with Morsi. So you can't win. It's really not the United States that decides. It's really up to the people. And President Obama, when he came into office, reached out. If you go back and read the speech he gave in Cairo to the countries in the region, including Iran. And then he was beaten up by his political opponents for being naive. So no, I don't think it has anything to do with the form of government. It's how the countries act internationally.
What about that, Mr. Dankoff? Does it have anything to do with the form of government or what? From the perspective of the United States and its relationship with various countries, for example, its relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, I think a couple of things will suffice to be mentioned here. One is that, yes, Iran did cooperate with the United States after 9/11, only to later be lumped by then President Bush as a part of the axis of evil. A couple of other things need to come into play here. Regardless of what Mr. Obama says, all we have to look at is what he is currently doing in Syria. The United States, the Obama administration, is working in tandem with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf cooperation states, and Turkey to overthrow a regime in Syria, because that needs to happen as a prelude to an attack, a military attack on the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mr. Obama is fully in support of this sinister policy, as a majority is in both houses of the American Congress. And then when we look at this whole business of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, my question is, since the Israeli lobby is this hung up on what Iran is or isn't doing with the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, why don't we get Israel to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which they have not signed, and turn over their known nuclear weapons capability and biological weapons capability and chemical weapons capability over to the same set of international sanctions and regimens and inspections that Israel, through the United States, is demanding that Iran be subjected to. The fact of the matter is that whether you're looking at American or European support for these sanctions against Iran, Israel and the Jewish lobby are behind it all. They are the driving force behind what's happened up to this point.
Mr. Korb, your take on that. It does appear that this situation, for example, we heard the statements by Mr. Netanyahu, basically already saying negative statements about Mr. Rouhani before he comes to office, that nothing is going to change. And we see that hawkish perspective in general coming out of Tel Aviv. And then we see Washington basically towing the line of Tel Aviv. It does appear that it is Tel Aviv that's pulling the strings of Washington, especially when dealing with relations with Iran.
No, in fact, there's a big difference. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, we will not let Iran get the capability to build a bomb. The United States position is, we will not let Iran get a bomb. There's a big difference between the two. And again, you've got to realize with Prime Minister Netanyahu runs a coalition government. He says things, again, to keep a lot of the factions happy. But as I said, I went back and checked. According to him, we should have been at war like 4 years ago. He keeps saying in 6 months, 6 months, 6 months. And again, that appeals to to certain elements in his coalition.
Well, what about appealing to certain elements? What about appealing to certain? Excuse me, Mr. Korb. What about appealing to certain elements? It appears in the U.S. Congress, because now it seems that the majority of the Congress people in the United States, they basically sound the same as Netanyahu.
Well, a lot of people are saying that, but again, I can't emphasize too much. I mean, in our system of government, when your Congress has no responsibility for foreign policy, so they can go out and give speeches and talk and whatever, you know, they want to do. If you listen, I mean, it's interesting that Obama's being criticized for Syria. No, the Congress wants him to do much more in Syria. And remember, that whole trouble started when the Syrian people began to protest peacefully against the Assad regime. It had nothing to do with foreign powers. And then you had the government turning on these people with very, very high-powered weapons. The United States has been criticized by its allies and members of Congress for not doing enough.
Oh, come on, Mr. Corp. Mr. Corp, we also have a country like Bahrain. Mr. Corp, we also have a country like Bahrain that people have been on the streets, that government has turned against their people, have killed many people, and mum is the word out of Washington. Mr. Dankoff, you were smiling at his comments and dealing with Congress. Your take, I only have about a minute left. Go ahead, Mr. Dankoff.
I will simply remind people of who has a disproportionate control, money-wise and power-wise, of both American presidential elections and American senatorial and congressional elections. It's clearly the Israeli lobby. They clearly want the United States to be involved in a war with Iran. And just to underscore a point where I differ with Lawrence, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution makes it very clear that it is the Congress of the United States, not the President of the United States, that determines whether we go to war with someone, when we go to war with them, and with whom we go to war. The fact of the matter is that in this very important situation that we now confront in terms of Israel and the Israeli lobby in the United States, they're going to get a war with Iran come H or high water.
All right, and on that note, we appreciate both of our guests for being with us. Broadcaster and commentator.
I doubt it.
Well, we hope not. Broadcaster and commentator, Mr. Mark Dankoff out of San Antonio, Texas, and from the Center for American Progress out of Washington, Mr. Lawrence Korb. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us. Make sure you join us right here, same time, same place tomorrow. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for The Debate. Thank you so much and goodbye.